Pyrophyta, also called the dinoflagellates, are another division of algae where we find single-celled organisms with very diverse shapes and sizes. They almost have, ornamental appearance in their diverse shapes, and they have single-celled organisms living inside these glass-like structures that we would call a shell. Now, we have two species of dinoflagellates, or Pyrophyta, that we need to learn about: Goniolax tamarensis and Pfisteria piscicida. In this group, we're going to see a new type of photosynthetic pigment that we haven't talked about before, and those are the red photosynthetic pigments called the phycoerythrins. Now, the reddish color, there's so much red in the Pyrophyta that when you see the massive growths of dinoflagellates along the coastline, which we call algal blooms, when there's just overgrowth or extreme abundant growth of algae in the water, you're going to see that there are so many dinoflagellates growing in the water that they actually appear to change the water's color from blue-green to orangish-red because there's so much dinoflagellate growth in the water. Now, we do find that the dinoflagellates prefer to grow in saltwater habitats, so they would be described as marine organisms. Notice in the lower right image, we also have another example of a dinoflagellate. Again, it's kind of spiky looking, and that is the genus Ceratium.
Also notice in the last few years, Goniolax tamarensis has now been renamed Alexandrium tamarense. Still the same organism, it's just from time to time scientists evaluate the placement and the phylogeny or relatedness of organisms and rename them as needed.
Here are several aerial photos of blooms of dinoflagellates, or overabundant growths of dinoflagellates, off the shore, the coastline, along the ocean coastline, causing what we describe as red tide. Again, there's so much dinoflagellate growth in the water, and these organisms are such bright reddish in color, reddish-orange, that it appears almost as if the water is on fire. You can see that it's a really bright reddish-orange color in the water due to the abundant growth of the dinoflagellate. It just happens that these dinoflagellates also produce a neurotoxin, a toxin that can be somewhat paralytic, definitely make you sick, and unfortunately, these little dinoflagellates serve as a source of food for animals that live in and around the water and in the coast, in the sand, like oysters and mussels, or filter feeders. The filter feeders will eat the dinoflagellates as a source of food and, unfortunately, concentrate the toxins in their flesh. That's why when red tide occurs, you'll find signs all along the coast that tell you to not eat the fish and don't get near the water so you don't get sick from the toxins produced by these tiny little dinoflagellates. Notice on this slide, at the top, there are various stages and shapes to some of the life cycles of these various dinoflagellates that cause red tide. In particular, this is Pfisteria piscicida, or just Pfisteria is the name of the genus. The Pfisteria actually can go through about 19 or 20 different changes in growth and shape and morphology as it keeps going and maturing through its life cycle. That's part of what made it very different to figure out what was causing some of the massive fish kill off the coast of North Carolina in the early 1990s. the fish were actually dying due to essentially infection or growth of the dinoflagellate in their skin. But of course, it took scientists a little time to figure that out. If you notice, the poor fish have these very serious looking lesions in their skin. And if you look off the coast, again, an aerial shot photo, you can see a little boat in the water, and the orange color in the water is due to the dinoflagellate overabundant growth that often leads to massive fish kill, which you see in the right-hand photo. Now, unfortunately, remember, this organism produces a neurotoxin, so even fishermen and scientists that are working with these fish have to be very careful and make sure they don't get any of the drainage and the material on their hands so that they don't get affected by the toxins themselves. It's even worse if you ingest it. But they found with Pfiesteria, there are even toxins that are released just from sort of handling or being, in the water with the fish that were affected.
If we take a look at this website, we'll see an example of what scientists have determined for the life cycle of Pfiesteria. Notice, it does make a difference in the form or the part of the life cycle depending upon if fish are present or not. The scientist by the name of Timo Springer worked out an example of the incredibly complex life cycle of Pfiesteria. I don't expect anyone to memorize any particular parts of this life cycle, but just to understand how difficult the challenge can be for scientists to determine life cycles. And in our case, we're always interested in what's the diagnostic stage or the infective stage. And with Pfiesteria, it looks like, at least at this point, roughly 21 different forms of the same organism occur in various parts of its life cycle, depending upon the environmental conditions. Studying these types of cellular changes can often lead scientists to more basic information about basic cell biology. So there are lots of reasons to do these types of scientific studies.
Algae that have a lot of red photosynthetic pigments in their cells, or phycoerythrins, which is another name for the red photosynthetic pigments in algae, are the Rhodophyta. The Rhodophyta are usually multicellular, but they can be single-celled, like the photo in the upper left-hand corner. They are usually going to be found in saltwater or marine habitats, but there are some that have adapted to freshwater, especially in and around Lake Michigan in the Great Lakes. Notice for the appearance, very bright red. In fact, the photo at the right on the top is an image of someone who stepped in sand that's essentially packed full of not just sand, but also tiny red algae that gives the sand its pink appearance. Now, in the division of Rhodophyta, we find several commercially successful and commercially important organisms that can produce various nutritional products or products that are used in the food industry. Commercially, red algae probably have some of the most beneficial organisms. And we have various chemicals like carrageenan and agar that are made from various kinds of red algae. Chondrus crispus, for the longest time, was the primary source of agar, also called agar-agar, for use in cooking and in microbiology. The agar that we use to thicken our media that we grow bacteria on in the laboratory is, in fact, the same material derived from these red algae. In recent years, another source of agar was discovered in a separate, very distinctively different species of red algae called Pterocladia lucida. It's allowed, essentially, the native country where Pterocladia is found, New Zealand, to be a new sort of industrial resource for the country. Red algae occur worldwide. They have lots of diverse forms and shapes. In fact, they're very often sort of very feathery looking or have very delicate structures, which is a little bit different from some of the other types of algae that we've seen in our illustrations. Personally, I think these are some of the most beautiful types of algae that somebody could work with. And there's still active research in finding new species of all kinds of algae in the world, and can be a very interesting type of job for someone working in finding new commercial applications for some of the products that various different kinds of algae can produce.